This is Jim Semivan, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and I am joined today by one of the UK's best-known authors and lecturers on unexplained mysteries and cover-ups. With more than 3 decades of research under his belt, he's also one of the UK's best to speak to on the crop circle phenomenon. Love to welcome to the podcast Andy Thomas. Andy, welcome.
Hello, nice to be here.
Good to have you on, another Andy on the podcast with me here. A lot to talk about, Andy, and I've actually got, largely we were here to talk about the crop circle phenomenon, but in scouting your books and your expertise, I've also thrown in some other bits and pieces that are, you know, stuff you've covered extensively over the years as well, because it would be remiss of me not to, I think. But let's get right into it. And first off, for anyone unfamiliar with yourself or your work, can you talk about your own background and how you got interested in the whole UFO crop circle phenomenon topic in the first place?
For sure. I mean, I'd always been interested in the kind of mystery realms. And I always remember my parents having a copy of Chariots of the Gods by von Daniken lying around. But for me, it was only really in 1991 when I actually saw crop circles for myself that really sort of sucked me into this world, because I was down in the West Country of England, where there are a lot of these things. And that particular summer was especially busy. And I was seeing these shapes in the fields virtually everywhere you looked. There was another one. There was another one. And I can't really explain, but it gave me this very strange feeling in the pit of my stomach that there was something here that I had to be drawn into, that I had to know more about. And not one person that I met could tell me exactly what was going on. And so what I then found from there was I started to talk to people who were investigating it. I joined what was back then the Centre for Crop Circle Studies, and met other people studying it. And then, of course, the minute you get into that world, you suddenly find you're also investigating UFOs, other paranormal phenomena. You're meeting people that don't believe what they're told in the mainstream media. And then I found for myself, just with the crop circles, that whatever you personally think about them, and I'm sure we'll come to that, the media wasn't being straight about it. You know, what it put out there just wasn't true. And then I thought, well, if that's not true, what else is not true? So, you know, really from there, I found myself writing a journal about crop circles. We started holding regular meetings. We're still going now, 33 years on, we're still meeting. And what's happened over the years is that, of course, then people start to come to you and say, well, what do you think about this? And, oh, will you speak about this? And then before you know it, you're being asked to write books. And here I am, in all these years on. This is the world that I move in. But it's, as you know, a world that I think needs more talking about rather than less, despite us all thinking there's a lot of talk about it. Still, in the wider world, much of what we would be interested in is disregarded. It's not taken seriously. But as we know, that is perhaps beginning to change.
Yeah, a lot to pick apart there, and a lot of stuff to touch on, I think I've got as part of my questions. First off, I want to ask maybe quite a basic question, but what is your definition of a crop circle?
Okay, so basically, these are shapes that appear in the fields. They've been appearing at least since 1678. If you go from the old woodcut that is very famous, shows the devil making a circle in a field. But there's actually several hundred historical accounts of crop circles. We've got photographs going back to the 1930s, 1940s. What you will find is back then they truly were crop circles. Now, some people will know today that a lot of them have become very elaborate shapes, and that's caused many controversies. But they gradually began to evolve. And then when we got to 1990, there was this sudden sort of burst of a more hieroglyphic form of crop circle. And from then, virtually any shape that you can imagine has appeared in the fields. The issue we've got is that, of course, the media's dismissed them. They say they're all the work of human artists, and some are, clearly. Anybody in the world of this knows that. But that really does not explain all of them. And there's so many effects, the way the plants are laid down, so many eyewitness sightings of these occurring within seconds, strange lights, very often seen in and around them. And I've had my own encounters with that aspect of it. when you start to put all the evidence together, you realize there is something here that is not just a circle in a crop. If anything, they're kind of gateways to a whole way of new thinking, and they're not straightforward. And it's because they're not straightforward that even now, here we are talking about them all these years on, because it's never been fully debunked. And in the eyes of some, there are a lot of crop circles that still demand better explanations than the ones we're normally given.
Yeah, terminology, I think, in these kind of phenomenon-related topics is really important, and they've undergone changes through the years and the decades. Most recently, UFO has gone to UAP. UAP itself has gone from aerial phenomenon to anomalous phenomenon, in various guises going back through the decades as well. Is crop circle almost inaccurate then? That you say originally it was circles, but there's all kinds of shapes coming up. So is it similar to someone saying flying saucers? Well, actually, there's lots of different shapes.
Yeah, I mean, so we would probably say crop formation. When I say we, the circle research community. So crop formation, we would call it. But of course, the circle is still one of the main components. Yeah, we get triangles and we get other shapes too, but you'll always find usually somewhere there is a circular swirl involved. And that is why some people believe that there is a natural element to this. And we'll probably get into this, but there is some evidence for that perhaps nature has a mechanism that is a vortex-bound mechanism that spins plants down, but that perhaps something else has also come along and thought that's useful, and it's using that mechanism in nature, but somehow nudging it, somehow adding to it. But it means that the circle is still, very much a predominant component of the whole phenomenon. So crop circle, it's fine to call them that. There was a brief trend for calling them agriglyphs, but it didn't really catch on. It sounded a little bit pompous. The crop circle, it's all right. It's accurate enough.
Agriglyphs is a bit of a mouthful. Yeah, I could see why that one never caught on, but crop circle is what it's known for. And the same with me, with a lot of folks trying to shift over to UAP. We know what UFO means. We know the connotations around UFO, good and bad. So I think when you shift to UAP and have that conversation with someone who isn't familiar with it, you just end up saying UFO anyway. So I imagine talking to someone in the public about agriglyphs and then they say, what? Crop circles, you have to get back to that definition, don't you? So let's call a spade or a crop circle a crop circle. You mentioned your first crop circle. Was it back in 1991? And if you can just talk about that whole event.
Sure. So, I was there basically on holiday, not looking for crop circles. I knew that they tended to occur around there, and I'd have thought it would be nice to see one, but that's as far as it went. But then we were staying in a place where you can talk to the people running it, and I just said one day, are there any crop circles around here? And the lady said, oh yes, and she came in with a load of maps and started saying, well, if you go there and if you go there, you'll see some. There's some there now. And of course, driving out to it, there the first one was. It was a very misty day. It wasn't brilliant sunshine, but that somehow made it all the more strange and alluring. And as the mist was rising, there was this huge shape, very hieroglyphic, what we would today call a pictogram type crop circle, just lying there. And I was so astonished, and as I mentioned earlier, it had a profound effect that then the rest of the next couple of days was spent trying to visit as many crop circles as possible. And the thing is, it's not until you walk in them and you stand in them that you realize the scale of some of these. Because in pictures, they're kind of diminished when you stand in there and you've got this huge expanse of flattened crop and then one bit leading off there to another bit and another bit there. It's almost like a cathedral-like space. And a lot of people have likened it to that. It's like sacred space you're standing in. And whether you think that was made by natural forces, an alien, or a person, that feeling still remains. And, if you go to a stone circle or an ancient temple, you still get that feeling. And we presume that they were made by people. So that is, I think, something that people overlook. When you just see the pictures, you don't quite get that experience. And then, of course, when you're in there, you look at the weaves and the way the plants are laid down and the way that they flow in very beautiful ways. And that is, again, something you really need to be there on the ground to get the full effect of that. And so, to me, I just came out of it with my head spinning. then tried to read every available book that was available then, and there weren't many, but literally it was 2, I think, or possibly 3 at that point. And it just grew from there. And the point that I find is interesting, though, is that here I am all these years later, I still do not have a definitive answer to it. Maybe a bit like, UFOs. We can gain more data, we can get perhaps a broader perspective that's getting nearer to something, but you're still not sure. And with the circles, it really is an absolute enigma. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about them, because of course that enables people to project onto them what they want from them. Now, you could say that's a bad thing, but on the other hand, it's enabled people to explore their own boundaries of belief without the answer actually mattering, and that's taken them on to all kinds of interesting lines of inquiry. And certainly that's what's happened to me.
So let's talk about the crop circles and what makes them exceptional then, because I think you've been very fair very early on to mention that there are, and you do this in your work as well, a lot of very intricate man-made examples, which are spectacular looking. But let's talk about those exceptional crop circles. What makes something truly anomalous? And you mentioned that feeling you get when you're inside a crop circle, that you feel maybe something a little bit special. Is that something, for example, missing from one you've maybe turned up to and very quickly realised, or through research, has been man-made?
Well, I think not necessarily. It's like what I was saying about creating sacred space. You can still do that, I think, manually as a human, if you're doing it with good intent. If you're doing it just for a laugh, you're going to leave a horrible mess there in the fields anyway, and we've all seen that. If you're doing it to try to hoax people, to actually try to get one over on other people, again, I think there's a not very nice intent there. If you did it to create genuine art, you could argue that wherever that shape divined from, that's still quite special. And that's one of the arguments that's been made for a long while, is look, we can get into big fights about, are they man-made, are they not? In my view, they are not all man-made. There's more than enough evidence to show that. But even the ones that are, if they move people and if they inspire people, if they were made with a positive intention, then I think there's something still, worthwhile about them. So you can stand in a field, and unless you were there when you see a crop circle when it was made, either by something strange or something mundane, I don't think you can say 100% where it came from. You can look at, is there damage? Is there this? Is there that trait of a man-made circle? And you might find them, but sometimes it's not so clear. And what I and my colleagues decided years ago was to look, let's get out of the fight about what made it, unless we know there was an eyewitness sighting of lights or an eyewitness sighting of somebody with a plank of wood making it. Let's just say what we see. So we would just say now, right, this was neat. This was messy. This had an incredible effect here. That was not sure about that. We just say what we see, and we try then not to judge. I'm not going to say, therefore, this was man-made, or therefore, this was made by UAP. I don't know. And I've learned with all my investigations over the years, if you don't know something, don't say it, because of course then the media just come down on you anyway, like a ton of bricks. And some of the early crop circle researchers did get caught out like that. They thought they'd learned to discern which ones were real and which ones weren't. And then of course they got people to make one, and then they invited them in and they said, what do you think of this? And then when they said, oh, I think this is a good one, they went, ha, we've caught you out. So, the best thing to do is just say what you see, and all you can do is have an accumulation of evidence that I think in the end sort of tips the scales one way or the other. And that's the way I try to work.
What are some of the exceptions, though, that when you turn up, you go, that really lean you potentially one way in your thinking? For example, I'm no expert in crop circles, okay, but I've got an interest given the UFO interest, obviously. And when I think crop circles, one of the things that always stood out to me when people have tried to explain real, genuine, or potential hoaxes is the exact angles of the bent stalks of whatever the crop was, and the fact that, if I say this incorrectly, please fix it, but like almost the kernels, the little bits inside the joints of the wheat have popped out due to high intense heat or radiation, whatever it might be, and that's something that a man-made crop circle, for example, you just couldn't do.
So that's an element to it. So let's cover that now then, because there have been over the years biological and anomalies discovered in plants in crop circles. Now, there was work done by the late William Levengood. He was a biophysicist. he got papers published in peer-reviewed plant journals, you know, saying, look, there really is something going on here. So, yeah, you tend to get an elongation of the nodal joints. So the knuckles you get on wheat and barley, they're often swollen, they're elongated. I think what you're describing there is you can often get a pitting in the cell wall. It does look like it might have been heated very briefly, and then there's been a kind of a brief puff of sort of super steam coming out of it. When you look also at the way some of the crop is bent, now we have seen plants bent at the nodal joint to go around curves. Now, if you ever get a piece of wheat or barley, you try and bend it on the nodal joint physically, you can't. Now, if you lay a piece of flat crop down and you leave it in the sun for a while, it can curl up. We know that. But if you go into a brand new formation where it's first thing in the morning, you know it wasn't there the day before, you can see that it's there from the start. And we've never seen that reproduced with a plank of wood or a garden roller or any of the usual things that you hear about. So that kind of thing is important. There have been other papers published. Inevitably, the skeptics will say the work was flawed, the methodology wasn't correct, you know, all of this. And yet the reality is those papers have never been rescinded. They still stand. They're in the record there in peer-reviewed scientific journals. And other people like Elcho Hasselhoff, Dutch researcher, did a lot of work with that. And also looking at the relation of balls of light to the crop circles, which is something that gets often seen in and around them. And maybe we'll talk about that in a moment. But just to talk about the physicality, you'll often find there are layers to the crop. So you'll find one bit's flowing around in that direction, but you lift it up and there's another swathe running in a different direction underneath. Now, yes, you could plan it like that manually to a degree, but there's other bits you think that's not possible. And you see weaves where stems have come together at exactly the same time, clearly, and you think that wasn't done with a plank of wood. And there's researchers like Dan Vidler, who's just published a very good book about this, who is observing the way the plants are laid down at really close quarters, saying there is no mundane explanation for that. So all of this, these are things that, you know, we would look for when you get into a crop circle, even before you look at the shape of it and the incredible geometry that might be contained within it. Because the mathematical properties of crop circles are, again, something else that is probably not discussed enough. And man-made formations, you know, whilst they've got more ambitious, beyond question, have often lacked, you know, many of the geometrical complexities that we've seen in, shall we say, the unexplained ones. So, you know, that is a whole other aspect to it as well.
Are there any other comparable phenomena in the world? So I'm thinking crop circles by name alone have a limitation that you have to have crops in the area, or the conditions for crops. And I suppose this might end up touching on like the messaging behind it, or the why, or what's creating this phenomenon. You mentioned ball lightning or orbs, whatever you want to call these phenomena. I'm thinking just there as you spoke, like, to really create something undeniable, if you imagine if another intelligence used a forest and you created some kind of crop circle, but literally bending full trees in ways that undeniably we couldn't do, that would certainly create quite a statement and a stir. I think the medium of crops still will always lend, regardless of, you know, the research or not, because the general public don't have that knowledge, do they, to look at a crop and think, well, that can't be man-made, because for all the reasons you've just stated. So
Sure.
what other phenomena are like this in the world? And I suppose the only thing I can think of off the top of my head are things like maybe the Nazca lines, where something looks like from above has been created to give a shape or a pattern.
So, I mean, you raised an interesting point there. So before we come to like trees, we'll talk about trees in a second. I mean, there is a feeling from some people that this phenomenon is a gentle process of acclimatization. So putting aside the man-made ones, the more unexplained ones are coming perhaps from a realm where something wants us to know that there is that realm there, whether it's extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional. But what it doesn't want to do is scare the living daylights out of us. So that it sort of starts gently, makes a few circles, makes them a little bit more complex, builds them up, until what we're doing without realizing it is acclimatizing to the idea of otherness being out there. Okay, so that is the theory. If that theory was correct, then of course, if they were to then do something so blindingly clear that it couldn't possibly be man-made. It's almost like that tips the balance too much. It's almost like going against the Star Trek Prime Directive. You're giving too much away. And it's almost as if it always just keeps you just this side of your intrigue, but it doesn't give you the 100% proof you want. So to talk about trees, so if you've got a forest where there was a huge circle of trees, that would be amazing, except it's claimed it has happened. So there have been pilots. I've got to tell you, I've not directly seen the evidence for this, but there are tales where going over like redwood plantations that there have been the tops of the trees swirled. Now, I have heard of sapling plantations having circles in them. And of course, you're talking stems like that. And apparently they were not snapped, they were bent. Well, I can't see any way you would do that with any manual implement. So there are tales of that. But there's also, as you've alluded to there, other mediums. So we have had glyphs carved into dry lake beds before now and deserts. I'll just give you two examples of that I think are worthy of more attention. In Oregon, in the United States, back, I think, in 1989, they found this huge sort of Hindu-looking Sri Yantra thing about a mile across, sort of carved into this dry lake bed. Now, it was never adequately explained. Some bloke tried to claim he made it with a rotavator, but then when he showed the cameras what he could do, it was just pathetic. And then in Australia in 1998, even now, I think it holds the record of the biggest representation of a humanoid figure in history. This huge sort of beautiful Aboriginal figure throwing a stick was discovered from a satellite, I think. And it was 2 miles in length, more or less. I think each line that made the pattern up was around 90 feet. And there it was in the desert. And that's never been explained. And again, then people tried to say, oh, somebody did it as an art project. Well, that's pretty major. And if they did, it's never been successfully claimed. So there are things like that. You get things carved into snow and ice and frozen lakes, which superficially look not unlike crop circles. You mentioned the Nazca lines. I mean, they are a mystery in their own right. We're told they were made by tribal people, but that doesn't really explain much because we still don't know who those people were or indeed how they did it. And many believe they could not have done that without some aerial component. So the point that I'm making here, I suppose, to respond to your question, is that there may be links between all of these, but of course they are such different mediums, it's hard to say. When you're in crop and you're looking at the weaves and the twists, it does seem very particular. But it may be we've got lots of things coming at us from lots of different angles, trying to draw people in by different means, and that the crop circles are just a part of something much wider.
If you were thrust into a last minute presentation up on stage somewhere, last minute dinners, speaking presentation or something, and they said, look, crop circles, throw something up for us, Andy, what's the kind of strangest or most unique crop circles you would be talking about on there?
I mean, to a degree, that's very subjective because lots of people will respond to different crop circles. And of course, some are fantastically hieroglyphic looking, they're very complex. Others are simple. Some of the simple ones, to me, can often be the most beautiful ones, much as I like, as anyone else does, all the big complex ones. I think what would stand out for me, I mean, I took part in the 1990s in some experiments to see, could we psychically interact with crop circles? And it's a longer story that we won't go into here, but we discovered that the more we did these experiments, the more crop circles began to appear around us. Some of the symbolism seemed to speak a little bit of what we were doing. Incredible coincidences occurred, and it was like something was listening into our thoughts. And we were very careful not to spread this outside of the very small group. And it kind of culminated in an experiment where we set up on a hillside one night and we did things with alignments, and we had a pattern that we thought might arise from doing this experiment. So, my colleague Barry Reynolds had drawn it, and we thought, that'll do if that appears. And it was like 6 circular elements: circle, ring, circle, triple ring, circle. When you put it together, it was like a growing line of circles. That very night, that formation appeared. And it was exactly as we had drawn it. Now, you got to just believe me, it's nothing to do with us. We didn't do it. Nobody else knew what had been chosen. And there it was. And it was so perfect. It was so beautiful. That's happened to other groups as well. Including, I might add, Stephen Greer's CSETI group some years ago, where their logo manifested, and they still claim to this day they didn't make it. And I think there is an interactive quality here. Other groups have found this. So that is something that I would point out. It's almost like what you think is then connecting to some wider ether, which then gets reflected back in physicality in the fields. Whether that's been done deliberately or whether we're part of some strange natural process that does it, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the weakness of that argument is, what's the mechanism? And I agree, I don't know what the mechanism is, but, when you look at quantum entanglement and things like that, I don't think it can be ruled out that there is some greater nexus at work here where people are a part of this, as well as what other intelligences and other natural forces may be involved.
I'll just state for the record, I'm very wary of a lot of the more recent work of Dr. Greer, and especially when you hear things like his logo appearing in a crop is very on brand for what he does. And that,
I know, I am aware of that.
Yeah.
It's not, all I can say is this, that if it was just him, maybe you'd be dubious. But there are people that I know and trust who did very similar work, who got the same results. That would make me think there is actually something to this.
Yeah. No,
on that occasion, who knows?
Yeah, aye, exactly. You've mentioned the media misrepresenting crop circles, and let's go into that a little bit. So, and expand on what you mentioned. You mentioned early on, you think the media takes the story of crop circles and portrays it in a light that's obviously disrespectful, diminishes the impact of the topic. Yeah.
I mean, it is disrespectful, but moreover, it's just usually uninformed. So let's go back to the first big debunk, and many people will be aware of this. So with all the kind of interest building up and the crop circles getting more and more elaborate, suddenly in 1991, these two elderly gentlemen came forward here in England and said, we made them all. And it was all a jolly joke. And they called themselves Doug and Dave. And it got great press and everybody was talking about them. And it seemed like an easy answer. And it was like, oh, it was almost a relief from the media. We don't have to think about weird stuff anymore. It was two chaps just having a laugh. Well, that was all well and good, but it was clear to anybody that knew the real phenomenon that Doug and Dave really had not made many of them. When they were challenged to make crop circles in front of the cameras, the ones they made just bore no resemblance to these incredible ones they were claiming. They had almost minimal knowledge of its history. They didn't seem to know it was an overseas phenomenon as well, because although England gets the lion's share, there have been many global crop circles over the years. They didn't seem to be aware of that. They weren't aware of its history either. And they broke this story in 1991. They said they had been making them for 13 years before then. Well, there's photographs going way back before that, records going way back before that, centuries back. And they clearly weren't aware of that. So what you then realized was, well, they don't even know their own hoax. They don't know what it is they're fronting here. And it was obvious that they were not the answer to the whole thing. But the media didn't care about the history. It didn't care about the details. It just wanted a great story. And if you want to go down the line, which some people do, that there is a cover-up around crop circles, well, of course, they were perfect. They put the public off. Some believed that they might have been paid to do it by the intelligence services. But whatever, it did work. And for years, people said, oh, it's just a joke now. And even now, even though Doug and Dave have been dead for years, people still say to me, oh, wasn't it those two old blokes making them? He said, that was over 30 years ago. And so the story really stuck in people's heads. Now, over the years, other people have said they've made them. We know there are artists that make some. So we all get that. But it's funny, despite that, the media is more interested in Doug and Dave and keeping that legend going because it was a very easy answer. And you saw that. You saw two old chaps running around with bits of wood. And of course, if you didn't know the phenomenon, that's a very impactful image to have. And it sticks in the brain. But the media has kept restating that story, even in the face of clear evidence that that wasn't the whole story by a long chalk. And they've often lied. There was a major television program that said there was no records of crop circles before the 1980s. you can go and look at the photographs, you can go and look at the records. It's not true. And you hear things like that over and over, statements that are simply untrue. And so therefore you realize that the media either has an agenda and they're dancing to someone else's agenda, or they are too innately skeptical to want to go there, or they're just stupid. And maybe it's a combination of all those things.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Is it ignorance? Is it, you know, is it maliciousness? Is it a combination? Is that what you think is most likely? Or is it just easy that, there's a lot of work if the media or an aspect of the media were to decide, this crop circle phenomenon is very much worth investigating and we're going to run a series of articles with experts and whatnot, and it's going to take months. Is that just too much work for something they either perceive the public won't have an interest in, it won't sell in the 90s newspapers, now it won't get clicks, even though I think it would get some click engagement? What's the reasoning behind that, or is it just systematic now?
I think it is systematic, but I think that was the point, that when that sort of general let's debunk it got set into place, it was very hard to break out of that. Some of it was malicious. I mean, especially the media here in England, you know what they're like. If they can take something down that once people like, they will, and they'll keep going like a terrier. They won't let go of it. So I think there's that.
The kind of tabloid media.
Yeah. I mean, they're the worst. But it's not just them. There's other media outlets too that have followed this constant line. They were shown all to be man-made in 1991. Wikipedia will more or less tell you that. And it's just not true. So that's the problem. Is that if we come along and we say, well, hold on a minute, there's all this research and there's this evidence and there's that scientific data and look at this geometry, that's too much for a journalist to take on board. It's like, you know what, I'm just going to stick with what I know. And this is more fun. And because we do not have clear answers, right, of course, they'll make fun of that. And they'll say, well, therefore, you're very weak. And they say, but look at this man with a plank. He's showing he can make them. Now, we all know that there's more than one cause to a lot of phenomena, but they don't want to think like that. And I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because now we're in a world where the whole UAP stroke UFO phenomenon is clearly becoming a major issue for our times. The American media is being much more open to that because it's more immediate for them. Of course, a lot of it's to do with the US military and all of that. But I mean, I don't know how you found that. I find that the British media are being very picky about it. They don't really want to hear it. And they're very grumpy about having to admit that maybe there might be something to the whole UAP thing after all. Because you almost sense that if they do have to say, all right, we were wrong, it was real, then they're going to have to revisit things like crop circles and other phenomena that they've been debunking for years. And they don't want to do it. It's just become too innate. So, it's going to be interesting. If there is a major disclosure, let's see. It'll be very interesting to see what that lifts the lid on, and whether the media will be prepared to eat their words, or whether they're still going to stick their boots in and just refuse to budge.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea that you're right. From a British point of view, the media just don't want to touch it. Even the big news organizations, the only story that's really been picked up in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, and anything you could call a major way, was David Grush coming forward. And that lasted, I think it was a Thursday or a Wednesday through to the Friday. And then by the Monday, it was gone out the news cycle. The interest was gone. But there was quite a substantial interest for those few days. And I just don't think the appetite's there. And we hear that quite often from listeners across the world, especially in the US, who wonder how it's been represented in the UK. And it's
Yes.
not really. It's not really at all. And I think from that point of view, I wonder, where do you think then the UFO, UAP phenomena conversation fits into a news cycle then? Because it's either got to be headline news because something major's happened, or it fits on as a tagline at the end of a news story, where alongside a cat being stuck up a tree, here's the classic X-Files music and a flying saucer whizzes across the screen, and they talk about little green men in a derisory fashion. So could you foresee that happening without something big happening, probably in the States, and it having an impact here?
I think it's interesting. I mean, Lou Elizondo's book has had a little bit of coverage over here, a lot
Yeah.
more coverage in America, but it has raised a few eyebrows. And I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to need more people who can definitively say, hey, they did work for the Pentagon or the military, which of course impresses journalists. But I think it probably will need the whistleblower that I know many people are hoping will come up soon, somebody really, really big that you've heard of, or that maybe at least, you know, as politician or something. I think that would tip it. But I still sense incredible denial in the mainstream media. And I think that there's almost a sense of panic, and maybe that's more true here, that, oh my God, what if it was true? And then I've got to say that all the silly debunking I've been doing all these years, you know, I was wrong. And I think they feel deeply uncomfortable about that, as they should. And personally, I'm looking forward to the day where there is some major disclosure, if and when it comes. I think something is going to break, personally, when a lot of people who have been scoffing at the likes of us for years actually have to say, well, all right, guys, you were right. But they're going to struggle. They're really going to struggle with that. And I think we're seeing a lot of dragging of heels at the moment. But yeah, I think there will come a story that will become too big, where I think that, you know, even they're not going to be able to keep this silly denial going. But what's interesting is, just coming back to crop circles, is that, because crop circles and UFOs are often linked together because strange lights do get seen in association with them. I have seen those lights. The ones I've seen are the balls of light, which tends to be more what gets seen. But there have been sightings of a larger object, stroke craft, over crop circles, and I see no reason to disbelieve that, as we know that there are weird things flying around quite frequently. So it then comes back to the point that if UFOs were then rediscovered as a serious subject, can they entirely keep blanking out crop circles? The crop circles, in terms of numbers, like this year's been quite a quiet year, the quietest year for a while, and yet still lots of really interesting things going on. There is a feeling from some that the crop circles were a herald of this era that we're about to go into, that acclimatization process was taking some people to that place of being ready to accept more information. And then if there is some grand revelation to do with ETs, it's almost like, well, that will have done its task. So maybe that will begin to fade down more to a background level now. And it's going to be stuff in the sky. It's going to be talking about that's going to become the new era. And that does feel like what we're going into at the moment. It's all unknown at the moment, I know. But certainly, you know, when you look at Grush and Elizondo and, you know, other people who are not so well known that are coming forward that do have official connections, how long can we all keep ignoring this? Well, we don't, but how long can the mainstream media keep ignoring it? So there will come a day where they won't be able to, but I don't think it'll be an easy day for them.
Yeah. So sticking with media, but changing tack slightly. So one of my favourite movies on the UFO topic, which incorporates crop circles very well, is Signs. Well, I think very well, but you might think otherwise. I'm sure you've seen it. Your thoughts on the idea and how that film, that crop circles are, and spoiler here, folks, but the movie's over 20 years old now, but the crop circles are used by alien species to coordinate attacks. And I wonder your thoughts on that as a hypothesis, but what are some of the other hypotheses you mentioned? For example, heralding in a new age of disclosure or, you know, appearances, whatever that may look like.
For sure. So Signs, I quite like Signs personally, but at the time when it came out, it outraged some crop circle researchers because it painted the crop circles in a negative light, because the aliens or evil aliens come to invade us, do whatever they're going to do. The movie, I think, works quite well. But I liked it for two reasons. Because number one, it did at least say it was real, because you get the people saying, oh, well, they were rubbish, and then it turns out they were real, which I quite like. But the other thing was that movie attracted incredible attention back to the crop circles. So after the years of Doug and Dave and nearly a decade of just, oh, yeah, it's all man-made, actually it created a lot of interest. And I mean, I give a lot of lectures and get out there, but after Signs came out, suddenly everybody was ringing me up, and even the press, and wanted me to give talks in cinemas and everywhere about crop circles. where I was able to then give a slightly broader view of it. So in my view, it actually helped, and it drew attention back to all the different crop circle researchers out there and what they were doing. And I think did them a favor. So I know some people were very angry about that movie, but to me, there was something there. Now, it did, of course, seed the idea that it's either aliens making them or it's all man-made. And it's not like that. Anybody that's been involved with this for a while knows it might be the ultimate answer to this is much stranger than we know. But that, again, is what the media like to boil it down to. If you go online, right, there's an interview I did for Vice TV a few years ago.
Yeah.
And it's been watched hugely. And actually, the original interview was quite long, and I talked about all the different possibilities. They edited it down to just me talking about aliens making them. And I realized that was their agenda. That's all they wanted to hear. And, I'll stand by the interview, but that wasn't the big picture. I actually said, but it could also be this, it could also be that. But that isn't what they wanted. So by all means, watch it and enjoy the interview. But bear in mind, there was a lot more that was actually discussed. It'd be great one day if they put out the full thing. There is a view that we've already mentioned that there might well be a natural component. And this is a bit technical, but briefly, if you just take southern England, which is the epicenter of British crop circle activity, you will find the majority of crop circles are appearing on the chalk aquifers. So an aquifer is any rock that carries a lot of water. Okay, that's all we need to know for today. We know that underground water can generate electrical effects in the ground. Is that in some way contributing to the creation of these shapes at certain hotspots? We know that nature can create incredible geometry, a snowflake, there's fractals, there's cymatic shapes. Nature can do incredible things. So there is a view, again, that there is something natural generating some of these, but that maybe some conscious force has thought, great, we'll use that and we'll make more complexity using that mechanism. So there's that. But the underground water connection is really fascinating, because if it's all a big hoax, as is argued, you could make them anywhere you want. And yet that's not how it works. Again and again, they're coming back to very distinct geological areas. So that's interesting. But then let's say, clearly, some of these display some level of intelligence. We've had astronomical diagrams in the fields. We've even had pictures of classic grey ETs, brilliantly done. One of them even had a message. So you then have to say, okay, some of this is clearly conscious, but does that prove, therefore, again, that it's only alien? Or what do we mean by alien? We now know, we talk about flying saucers, nuts and bolts craft, but it seems like they're multidimensional anyway. And there's entities passing back and forth, as is postulated at the whole Skinwalker Ranch thing, that might come from a number of different realms. It may well be that's what we're looking at with crop circles. And it may also be that it isn't just one thing. There might be natural circles, alien circles, man-made circles, psychics. It could just be there is a mechanism that anything can learn to nudge if you can somehow get under its skin. And there's another argument, which is actually a lot of them may not even be intended for us. We see them and we're drawn in and we think something's trying to attract our attention. That could just be human ego. Maybe they're there for some other purpose altogether, or it's entirely frivolous and it's just alien graffiti. But, the answer is we don't know. But what I always come back to is the way they make people feel is what matters. And it's opened people's minds. And, a lot of people who were very skeptical about anything like that, when they actually saw a crop circle, either in the flesh or sometimes even just from a photograph, it's triggered something. Something's happened, and it's made them far more open to looking at the world with new eyes. And that's real wherever they came from. And I've always thought that's one of the biggest gifts, because a lot of people that began with crop circles then went on to do a lot of other work in a lot of other realms that's actually had a good effect in the world. And, I've always thought, well, that's good enough justification for me for why they're there.
I've got Dan, who comes on the podcast regularly with me, and he's a big proponent of, ball lightning, orbs, and, lights that are seen around the world in various different places. He's done some investigation, kind of boots on the ground on that in Colombia with a team. And he would very much, probably bastardize this, but he can fix it another time for me. But the fact that something could be a natural phenomenon doesn't mean that it's also not intelligent and potentially resident to this planet. So an orb or ball lightning creating something like this could be natural, but doesn't mean it's also not under some kind of other intelligence control. And I think those conversations at the minute are best kept for these sorts of circles, pardon the pun, where, you know, people like ourselves and people listening or watching this have an interest in the topic. Because when you start to broach that with, I feel, members of the public, I can only talk for example, people I work with in my day job, that just starts to glaze eyes over, and that's a step too far in the conversation. Do you find that?
Yeah, I think again that's why, you know, people tend to latch on to the skeptical theories because they seem clear, they seem very immediate. Whereas, you know, our vagueness talking about all these possibilities, yeah, you can't just absorb that in a few seconds. I mean, what you've mentioned there is interesting. I mean, if you look at the work of Andrew Collins, who's now a well-known archaeologist, but for a while he was into crop circles, that's exactly what he thought. He thought there was a natural component. He thought it was to do with orgone energy, but that it can combine with intelligence, it can be influenced by intelligence. It was part of a collective process. So yes, there are people that believe that. The balls of light, I mean, are really fascinating. So when I saw the ones that I saw back in 1993, I was present with two other people. We watched these green spheres of light appear over this field, and then they would suddenly move off and shoot off. And then on another occasion, I saw another streak of light. And we also saw these very strange dark shapes hovering over the fields. And it's funny because I perked up when I heard Lou Elizondo just recently talking about the green spheres of light in his house, because actually what he described is very like what we saw over a field. Is it the same thing? Is it just a natural plasma? Is it intelligently controlled? Even Elizondo says he doesn't know. And that's true of the crop circle balls of light as well. Some have argued they are an intelligence in themselves, or are they a byproduct of the natural energies creating them, or what? You know, and the answer is we don't know which way round it is. Eljo Hasselhoff believed the lights were making the circles and came up with a reasonable hypothesis that might show some truth to that. But again, you're always left never being sure. On one level, it's frustrating, but equally, at least it leaves it open to, you know, people to come in with new ideas, and maybe somewhere we'll get somewhere.
We'll come back to Andrew Collins' work because I've got a rather extensive listener question on that. So you'll need your notepad and paper for taking notes as I read the question to you when we come to it. But we'll get there. I want to just touch then. This is going to go back a little bit on what you talked about with the public and disclosure and whatnot. But first off, I don't tend to on this podcast look too far outside the UFO sphere. Remote viewing, crop circles, all easily linked into that conversation. But I know enough about other conspiracies, especially from being younger, to at least entertain the topic. And conspiracy theories in general are something you write about. Not that you're just compiling list of here are the top 100 greatest conspiracies, but you actually look at the notion of conspiracy theories and books like The New Heretics. You obviously, it was 2021. Links for all Andy's books will also be in the description to the podcast. But you talk about, you know, the notion of conspiracy theories, where they come from, the fact that you can have conspiracy theories for good, bad, you know, they're for disinformation potentially, or sometimes there's smoke where there's fire, you know, for example. For me, the biggest influence on conspiracy theory, at least in the last 50 years, has been social media. And I want to know, given your research and background in this, do you think our access to information and such wild speculation and opinion online has been a help or hindrance to people perpetuating conspiracies under that label?
Sure. Oh, I think it's both. I mean, it's a medium. The social media is a medium, and like any medium, it's a tool that you can use for good or for bad. I think it's being over demonized at the moment. Yes, there are things certainly you need to be very careful of allowing, but at the moment, you know, the edges are blurring and they're taking down stuff or threatening to that should be there. There's no reason why it shouldn't be available. It's not entirely new. So what, you know, if anybody reads my work, and especially the New Heretics book, I'm trying to understand conspiracy thinking. I'm not condemning it. I'm not saying you should believe it either. I'm trying to understand it. And I personally have seen enough areas that have shown me conspiracies clearly do exist sometimes, and therefore you need to be open to them, but you need evidence. You know, somebody just saying this is a conspiracy and not giving a reason is dangerous. And we've seen, you know, the results of that recently. However, if you then get into the realms of saying this is new and it's all because of social media, well, that's not true. If you look at the history of conspiracy theory, you'll find many times, mainly since the invention of the printing press, I've got to say, where pamphleteering got mobs onto the streets. Riots occur because somebody printed up a claim. Yes, it was slower back then. Now, of course, it happens instantaneously and somebody will forward something on in a matter of seconds without checking it. So that's where it's become problematic, but it isn't new. And if you go back to the Roman times, even, and I write about this in some of my books, conspiracies, belief in conspiracies, real plots, real assassinations, that was part of life back then. And everybody knew that. Nobody trusted the authorities. Everybody knew they were being had over. So that distrust in authority has always been there. And, you name the century, you find very similar times, and somebody spreads a story, mobs take to the streets and so on. And it still happens now. It just happens a little bit more quickly. But I do think that there is too much ease of just blaming the digital world for this. And I think that misses the point, because especially social media has also allowed conversations and sharing of information like what we're sharing here in a far more open way. That wasn't really possible before the internet came along, or it was very slow. It was hard to get information. That to me has been a bonus. And I don't think we should ever overlook that. Communities often now are held together by social media. It's the abuses of it. It's when it then turns rather dark, of course, that we always hear about. But I'd like to hear a little bit more balancing stuff, saying, yeah, but also this is also a brilliant tool. And I always wince when I hear the latest, we must ban this, we must ban that, we must stop people seeing that. Because what happens is authorities that don't want you to see the real conspiracies, they will blur those boundaries. And that's how they take information away and take down videos and whatever it is that they're taking down that should be there. And people have a right to those views. We've seen a lot of that of late. So that's my concern. So I don't believe in every conspiracy theory, but neither do I believe everybody should be condemned for believing what they believe. The onus is on them to produce evidence, but you have to allow a forum where that evidence can be produced. If you go into hatred, if you start telling people you're going to beat that person up or kill them, obviously that's no go. You can't do that. That's not a world that's sane. But if they are saying, look, I think this should be looked at, I think this should be considered, whether they're right or wrong, there should be a forum where they can put that down. But we're moving at the moment into a world where it's getting increasingly harder to do that. And I do worry a lot about the hardline censorship that's coming in. And especially when AI begins to determine what we're going to see in the future. And I've been speaking and writing a lot about that of late. That becomes problematic, because what AI is programmed with will determine a lot of the human history to come, if there's any of it left, by the time everything's run by AI. And we need to be sure that certain areas of information are available to it. And if you just take UAP stroke UFOs, right, it needs to be able to see the big picture of that. If it was programmed only with what the arrow or the government wants you to see, it's not going to be a fair reflection of it. So we need to all now be arguing now for, within reasonable boundaries, very open information that, the tools that we see information through can find and can use. I'm concerned at the moment that we're heading down a bit of an Orwellian route. And I think we should come back into a better balanced place on that.
Just to follow up on that then, so in the book you mentioned that even with the release of the Tic Tac, the gimbal videos to the public, there was no mass push towards disclosure, but also, there was no huge panic, that many seemed comfortable with the idea of non-human intelligence potentially being on the table. You mentioned there's 1 in 3 people polled in the US very much believe that alien intelligence is visiting the Earth. So there's a groundswell there that maybe people are more open to the idea. So is it a positive notion that it isn't being outright dismissed by the public or some elements of the government, or is there almost within that a general malaise towards the conversation, that it's almost dismissed, even though it's being acknowledged that, yeah, there's probably alien life out there, and that could be problematic in the long run to really go in the next step?
I mean, I think partly what we have at the moment is people are so bombarded with either new strange information, or they look at the news and it's all very depressing and it's all war and that, and they don't want anything else that confuses them. In times like that, people will often narrow down to what they like and what they're used to, and they don't
Yeah.
want to hear about the weird stuff. It's not necessarily that they won't believe in it, but it's almost like they're worried that they might believe in it if they do see it, so they can resist. But equally, the public's been encouraged to be stupid for a long time, especially here in Britain. And, as we've talked about, it's going to take a while to reverse that oil tanker. If it turns out there is truth to a lot of this, then a lot of people have been told not to be interested. So inevitably, that's the way they're going to be. But I do think that we are in an acclimatization process, whether the circles are part of that or not. And I think the release of the UAP videos that you mentioned there, I think we're part of how people are going to react. Let's just see. And because it was presented fairly unsensationally, I think people kind of thought, okay, well, maybe that's interesting. Although the average Joe on the street still doesn't know anything about that. If they saw it, they probably forgot all about it almost within a day. But then, you get this sort of feeling that there are things building up. I thought it was really interesting, the Miami Mall incident, where alleged aliens were seen walking through the mall. Now, look, I don't know the truth of that, but I think something interesting possibly happened. But what I thought was interesting was the fact that that went so big, and especially in America, and that story was, widely broadcast. I kind of felt, are they just pushing this alien angle just to see how people react? To see what if aliens did appear in Miami? And it's almost like somebody's observing that. And each new thing that comes along, it's like, how are they going to react? And just, I think, was it yesterday? Am I right in thinking the US police forces have been, they've got a new program now for recording UAP? And they've been issued with new instructions as to how they should deal with that. Now, the fact that that story's gone round, it doesn't really tell you anything, but it makes you think, oh, the police are taking this seriously. So it's another step, and the military are talking about it. Oh, another whistleblower. So it does feel like it is building to something when, as I say, one day, right, if we don't get catastrophic disclosure, they'll think, right, okay, now they're ready for the next step. And we've all heard of them. We have programs of disclosure, allegedly, and it's several years, and we can do this, and we can do that. And it does certainly feel at the moment that it is heading in that direction. Whether everybody will believe what they're told to believe when it comes to it, though, is another matter. And of course, in the conspiracy world, a long-held theory has been that there will be a fake alien invasion that will thus, enable the government to take more control and help the New World Order. And even if there's major disclosure and footage and goodness knows what, a lot of people will say it's fake, or it's Project Bluebeam, or is it, there's going to be a core of people that are going to doubt what they're told, and even some of the public, because they've been so confused, told to believe that, now they're telling you to believe this. It'll be a very fascinating time, but be a very disruptive time, I think, if that next level of disclosure comes. And I think there'll be huge confusion for many years, and we're all going to just have to see what feels right in the pit of our stomach, I think, because proving who to believe, even when an alien appears on telly and starts talking to you, a lot of people are just going to go, oh yeah, right, come on, we've all seen that in movies. And because we're in a world of deep fakery, who knows what's real now? So it's going to be, I think, fascinating times ahead. Not easy times, I'm sure, but on the other hand, maybe it was something we always had to go through sooner or later.
And I think the biggest name in the last few days promoting the UFO topic was Taylor Swift, who wore 2 UFO mini dresses out and about, which immediately goes viral, gets people talking. And like you say, you could look at it one way, that she just wore a UFO themed dress. It was something a bit different. If it was strawberries, would the strawberry community be going as wild? Probably not. Who knows? But also, is that a way of really capturing a huge audience where she is one of the biggest names on the planet, right now, is particularly with a lot of attention on her. And if you were going to start to promote a message to different demographics, Taylor Swift would be surely right up there at the top of the list to do that as well. So, Andy, there's a lot of listener questions to get through. So in this second part of the podcast, I'd love to get on to some of those. Thank you to everyone who submit questions. There were so many came through. First one slightly touches on some stuff we've talked about, but I'm sure you can pull something else off the top of your head here. So from Limo, or Liam, as I found out, what are the standout cases that defy the odds of it being man-made? Examples, maybe the impossible time it took to make, the intricate design, or lack of evidence of footprints, tracks, maybe someone witnessing one made before their eyes. And you've given a few examples, but if you can think of anything else worth noting, that would be appreciated.
For sure. Yeah, well, thanks for that question. And the first part of that picks up on something very important, because many crop formations have appeared within really short periods of time. So we know from seeing the ones people make, they can take many hours to create. Sometimes, looking at 9-10 hours. When in the middle of the night, if you're going to get a crop circle appear in dark, because you're going to work by dark if you don't want to be caught, you sometimes barely got 6 hours of true darkness to work in the middle of a summer. And that is an issue, because there's been over 10,000 or around 10,000 recorded formations over the years. And so few people have ever been caught in the act of making them. Suddenly this huge thing is just there. And we know there have been many daylight occurrences. There's a famous example of one that occurred directly opposite Stonehenge within 45 minutes. And the skeptics say, oh, no, it was there all day. They didn't see it. That's ridiculous. There's photographs and there are witnesses that prove it had not been there. And it appeared in a very short time window. When you speak to the eyewitnesses, and I've interviewed a number of them over the years, they all say these things occur within seconds. It's usually less than 10 seconds. So you've only got to be just looking the wrong way and you turn around and it can be there. So the time factor is a big part of it when you compare to how long people need to create them. So that is a very important point. The eyewitness sightings I find really fascinating, and they are undersold. There's eyewitness sightings on records, even going back to the Victorian days when they didn't even know what a crop circle was. I've interviewed some of these people and I find them credible. And I find them consistent. And at least 2 of them did not know what a crop circle even was when this happened to them. And so they weren't loading it with any baggage. It was just, this happened. And that to me is good enough to say that at least some are not man-made. Even if you wanted to boil it down, I think many more than that are not man-made. But even just those ones alone, that's good enough. There is a famous video showing a crop circle appearing, very contentious. I don't know. It's never been officially completely debunked. There's claim and counterclaim. Some believe it's real, some don't. But even if you take that away, there's enough evidence, I think, that they are appearing very, very quickly. We've mentioned the biophysical evidence, and that is definitely worth looking at, the effects in the plants. There's even been people looking at the soil and claimed imbalances in nitrogen and nitrate ratios only beneath the crop circles. It's, we need a lot more work on that. But that all put together, especially with some of the most extraordinary geometry that a lot of people don't appreciate if you don't know how that works, and you realize, yeah, okay, there's something here that needs better explanations than we normally receive from them. And certainly it would be lovely if the media would sit down and look at some of that evidence. But as we've already said today, they don't want to be shown to be wrong, or they haven't got the time, or for some reason they're just not going to go there. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. Thank you for the question, Limo. Christian, who's the host over at Kill the Stigma podcast on YouTube, he asks, or he says as well, I was very skeptical of crop circles because I was ignorant until I saw a Y-Files episode that blew my mind. The Arecibo answer is very interesting, and the one that says, beware of the bearers of false gifts and their broken promises. Believe there is good out there. We oppose the deception. That sounds almost like a message to the programme if I had to speculate, especially if there's deals. Anyway, the evidence and electromagnetic fields around the circles are fascinating, and I'm not sure why that doesn't get more attention, since it's so easy to tell which ones are authentic and which ones are not. There's also crop circles showing wormholes or portals. So can you just touch on maybe that whole idea of electromagnetic fields around crop circles being a really key point of evidence?
For sure. So, I mean, back in, I think, 1992, there was what was called Project Argus, where a number of more scientific-minded crop circle researchers try to take a lot of electromagnetic readings and, look at different aspects that you could detect on meters and electrostatic qualities, things like that. And they clearly detected anomalies that were hard to fully explain if it was just a normal field. But the problem you've got with anything like that is, and a lot of people say they go into crop circles, they feel an electrical tingling. People have had all kinds of extraordinary experiences, and you take a compass in and the dial will whiz round, or your phone won't work. Then it works when you come outside of the crop circle. All of this stuff. It is interesting, and I think should be taken into account. The problem you've got is, unless you were in that field before that crop formation appeared, you don't know that you might not have got those readings anyway. So, there's areas of radon gas, there's radiation in some places, there are electrostatic anomalies just naturally. That's always the issue you've got, that getting an accurate control reading is very hard. So it might well mean something, and in my view, more work does need doing on that. But it's something that I think needs a proper scientific study into. And what I'm really hoping is, if the UAP thing goes big, people will start to come back and look at things like circles and think, all right, well, we were shown to be wrong on that. Maybe we should relook at this. And then a lot of money will be put into it. A lot of scientific bodies will not go near crop circles because of all the debunking. And that's the problem. When they're the people we need to show that there is something going on. Very briefly, I must just pick up on the alien and the disc crop circle that you mentioned with the message. So that appeared in 2002. It's never been claimed by anyone. It's never been reproduced by anyone. It's very clever. So this kind of grey being was made of lines scanning across, getting wider, getting thinner. And it's not until you blur it that the half tones that are basically embedded into it work. And that was in itself a kind of a sequel to a not dissimilar one the year before of a kind of a humanoid face. But the message was really fascinating. It was rendered in ASCII code, which can generate text on the computer. You translate it, and it is the message that you just read there, Andy. But it's something that's easy to be cynical about. But, I was in that formation. I walked from the center of that disk of code all the way out to the outside. It was a spiral. It took me about half an hour to walk it. And you realize, my God, you only had to get one of these standing pillars of crop wrong, and that code would have got corrupted. So that's not proof of what made it or who made it, but it was an incredible piece of work. And all these years on, it's never been explained that the message is not a quote from anywhere. It's never been repeated on that scale. We've had the odd word in code, just individual words, the odd fragment. It's never gone back to anything like that. And when you read that message, look it up. It does seem to take on more resonance as the years go by, about deception. We oppose deception. The conduit is closing, things like that. And it just kind of feel like that's very appropriate for the times we're in now.
Absolutely. Question from Shane. Shane says, what does Andy think about the 1990s video showing the balls of light creating the crop circle? National Geographic said it was a hoax, but as far as I know, the hoaxer's identity was not ever disclosed. And if that video was fake, what about all the other videos from Milk Hill that show similar balls of light over the fields and even military helicopters flying low and approaching one of the lights? Were those fakes as well? I don't understand why only one famous video is said to be a hoax, but all the others were never called out as being hoaxes.
Okay, so that goes back to the video that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. So that was taken at a place called Oliver's Castle in 1996, on August the 11th that year. And it's now a well-known piece of footage. So the story is this, that a chap was out looking for UFOs. It is a well-known UFO spot. It's a beautiful place to be, Oliver's Castle. And just as it was getting light, first thing in the morning, he saw these lights flying over the field and started to film. And you see these balls of light fly over the field, and then this sort of snowflake type design unfolds within seconds beneath them. Very like what many witnesses have described. So the thing is, right there, even back then, some people said, oh, it must be a fake. And there was somebody called John Wabe, or was he called John Whaley, that was accused of doing it, that might have had access to that equipment. But in the end, it was all kind of hot air. And they, those accusations might be true, but it wasn't shown to be true. And what I find fascinating is, all these years on, there's never been a definitive ta-da moment where he said, yeah, I did it, and this is how I did it, and this is why I did it. Some people think that the guy that took it was pressured to shut up and then say, oh, yes, it was a fake, but they never really give the evidence for that. For National Geographic to state categorically that it's a fake, well, that is another bit of media nonsense. You can believe it's fake if you want. There's no absolute proof that it is. And it certainly shows what many people have said they've seen over the years. What strikes me, though, is that here we are today in a world of deep fake videos where it's easy to knock up anything. I've never seen a video as convincing looking as that. And that was back in the 1990s, steam-driven gear. And that's what I find fascinating. So the jury's out on it. But as a representation, if nothing else, of what it looks like to see one appearing, it does follow what so many eyewitnesses have said. And then just to pick up on the other videos of balls of light, yeah, I think that they are real, because the lights that I've seen in those videos are very like the lights that I saw. And here's the thing. There were often lots of people present when those videos were taken, because of course you could say, oh, it's a fake video, but a lot of people said, well, I was there, I saw this. And again, that was back then. Faking a video like that at home was not an easy task. Yes, today it's a lot easier, but that wasn't the case back then. And I think a lot of those videos are authenticated. Military helicopters chasing balls of light has been seen. They're often seen flying over the crop circles. Whether that means the military have got anything to do with making the circle is a whole other matter, but they're certainly interested. And of course, in Wiltshire, you've got Salisbury Plain around the corner where they train a lot of military personnel. So they're going to think, oh, hey, let's go and fly around that. And we all think that they're here to do something dubious. But that said, the military would be very foolish if they weren't monitoring them. You kind of hope they do, really, because otherwise they're not doing their job. So the videos are interesting. Today, if a video came forward like that, you'd need a hell of a lot of witnesses that were there at the same time, or several cameras all at the same time. But that's the dilemma of the whole times we live in.
Yeah, very much appreciate that commentary on the videos. Peter asks, and we'll come back to some of Peter's questions and the bonus stuff for the folks who are on the paid feeds. But one of Peter's questions I've picked out for the free feeds: has Andy ever experienced the hitchhiker effect, perhaps after visiting recently formed crop circles? So any kind of activity that's followed you home, let's say.
Well, yes, is the answer to that, because and I wrote a book with the late Paul Bura years ago about the experiences we had that I mentioned earlier on, where we were trying to do psychic interaction with crop circles. So the idea was originally to film a crop circle appearing. We didn't achieve that, but we did achieve that one in the shape that was the one that we thought it would be, that I talked about earlier on. So the more we all started to do these experiments, the more strange things began to occur. So I'll say a little bit more detail. Like on the very day that we gathered at Paul Bura's house to discuss what we were going to do, in the field, as near as you could get to his house, was the first crop circle in that part of the country of that year. Now, it never had a crop circle in that field before, as far as we know. And it was like, whoa, hang on, that's a big coincidence. It's almost like something was saying, yeah, maybe you're onto something. And then each of us started to see strange things, like the balls of light that I saw with Martin Noakes and Gorilla Gilgannon. That was while these experiments were going on. My colleague Barry Reynolds, as we were doing this, saw a ball of light traveling across a road and ran down the hill to try to see it and get closer to it. And then I had some very strange things occur in my house. So we were making sort of some inroad to trying to be psychic. I knew nothing about this. And looking back, I was probably horribly naive. But, I now think there are actually powers that you can invoke that you need to be a bit careful of. And I think that's what happened. And I started to have strange things happen around the house. My typewriter, not a computer, right, an old electric typewriter, suddenly started typing by itself one day. This part gobbledygook, part odd, strange words and fragments of phrases. And very stupidly, because I was afraid, I turned it off. And now I wish I'd let it go, because what would it have said? I still can't explain that. The company that sold us typewriter assured me it had no memory. There was no way it could type by itself. That was unknown. And then one night, having watched a television program about the Berlin Wall, and they were showing people drilling into the wall and how they destroyed it and everything. Just after I'd gone to bed with my then wife, in the middle of the night, the walls in the bedroom started to shake, and everything was like, it was like somebody was drilling, this horrible loud sound, and we thought literally somebody was drilling through the wall. And this happened twice that night, and there was no explanation. We could not understand it, and the neighbours that were next to us didn't hear a thing, because we said to them next day, "Were you drilling through your wall?" And looking back on it, I wonder, and I can't prove this, but I wonder, was it some psychic expression of what we'd been watching that night that then somehow manifested? Now, I know this sounds utterly balmy, but I'm actually writing a book at the moment about these kinds of experiences, and I'm actually going to go into that in a detail that I haven't before, because I now have a kind of a wider context to understand it. So the answer is, I think yes. And the fact, the more that we did towards the crop circles, the more strange things we got back. If you want to call that the hitchhiker's effect, yeah, I think it did happen. And when I hear about Elizondo and his balls of light appearing in his house, I can fully understand how that might come about.
And I appreciate you sharing those experiences as well, Andy. Riposte says, "Hi, Andy, and also Andy. My question is, have you ever come across any government involvement, UK or otherwise, around crop circles? Things like they were investigating it themselves, discrediting it, harassing notable crop circle researchers, or have they generally steered clear of the topic?"
Okay, so personally, I've never encountered anybody intimidating me or making me feel that they work for the military intelligence or anything like that. Well, although I would say that, wouldn't I? I don't know, but I've never had that. Now, there are researchers like Colin Andrews, who was an early researcher, who has implied that he did receive what he felt was some level of intimidation. We do know, so Colin Andrews and his then colleague Pat Delgado, they did an experiment in 1990 where they had cameras over a field, they had a TV program working with them, and they were hoping to capture a crop circle appearing. One did then appear in front of the cameras, but it turned out, or at least they believe, some have argued it was real, but that a man-made formation was made in front of them to discredit it. And they'd been working with the military at that stage, to try to capture the crop circles. And there was a suspicion from some that the military actually then made that crop circle to dissolve a lot of the interest. Actually, it didn't dissolve all the interest, which might be why they had to come up with the Doug and Dave scam almost exactly a year later. There is that. And then with Doug and Dave, so a researcher called George Wingfield, he tried to track down the press agency that put out the Doug and Dave story. It was called MBF Services. And there was no such press agency. Never was, never has been. And the only phone number that Wingfield winkled out of the press turned out to be an office with, in his view, connections to MI5. Now, that's like our intelligence services over here. And you couldn't prove anything beyond that, but it kind of made you think it's not impossible, is it, that these two jokers who would have done anything for a backhander, they were quite well known for fronting any old thing for a laugh, could easily have been, impressed into being part of a scam. And that you wouldn't need to do anything too heavy, because especially in England, we're impressed by silly jokers with bits of wood. We love all that, and it did the trick, and they didn't need to get any heavier. There are individuals who claim they've been chased by this person or that person, or seen men in black. I mean, who knows? I think sometimes people say that because it makes them look more important, but that's not to say it's never happened. Now, certainly in the UFO world, I do believe it has. And the circles, I think on the whole, any inference of government sort of involvement or, some level of intelligence to try to shut it down. If it is there, it's quite laid back, or at least there's no absolute smoking gun that you can find. But that's not to say it's never happened. And there's claims it was a D notice, which is a government notice not to report it, put on a particular crop circle some years ago, according to Colin Andrews. If that's true, that obviously is fascinating. And certainly, you can be sure the authorities don't want us talking about it any more than we are. And hence, I think the constant debunking.
So you've mentioned Colin Andrews a few times, so let me get to this question from Jeff. And Jeff sent in a few bullet points for context, but I won't read them all, but I'll let you then follow up. So Jeff asks, where does Andy stand on the Colin Andrews findings now? Jeff says in 1999-2000, Colin Andrews was paid at least £100,000 by the Lawrence Rockefeller Foundation to investigate the origins of crop circles and the extent of man-made formations over 2 years. Lawrence Rockefeller paid for this as part of his funding toward UFO research, aiming at disclosure, as it wasn't known how complex formations were created. Colin Andrews hired private detectives and also himself did examination of the major formations those years, and surprisingly to the crop circle community, concluded that 80% of formations in those years, including complex precision ones, had been man-made. And Colin Andrews seemed to conclude in his book On the Edge of Reality that people meditating and visualizing formations, which then appeared overnight for them, were in fact telepathically connecting with the human circle makers, not an unknown mysterious force. So curious on those, and there were some other bullet points in there, but I'd be here all day. So Thank you, Jeff. And obviously, Andy, you've touched on Colin Andrews there. So your thoughts?
I'll take that last point first, because when we did our experiment and then that circle appeared, we've always maintained if somebody received that image through the ether and then made it, that is as amazing to us as whether an alien made it. Yeah. And I've heard human circle makers saying, I was inspired by higher forces. How is that any weirder than an alien coming down and making it? I don't see any difference, really. So I would still be impressed by that. So Colin Andrews, so I've had a few run-ins over the years in the early days with Colin because I disagree with some of his findings, but I also give him enormous respect because there's no question he was one of the first people to bring very good public attention to it. Colin, I think, enjoyed the limelight. I don't think he'd mind me saying that. He did, but he also did a good job with that, of drawing people in and saying, look, there is something worth looking at. My personal belief about the Rockefeller funding is not that he was suddenly working for the New World Order. I know some people thought that. But my personal belief is that the evidence that he looked at to come up with the 80% of man-made is fairly questionable because it was so subjective. And this is what we found all along the way, because, other people have come forward saying, oh, I've seen evidence that's man-made. When you actually say, what's the evidence? They say, well, that bloke in the pub told me. Not good enough. That's not evidence. The only evidence you can have that something was man-made is when you were there watching them do it or somebody filmed them making it. That's it. Beyond that, it's hearsay. And a lot of people use hearsay as evidence that, and you hear it said a lot, that the majority of crop circles are man-made. That's not evidence. It's an opinion, in my view. We know that some are man-made, right? End of the story. We know that. You can believe many are man-made or some are man-made, whatever fits right with you. But you have to base it on evidence. And if you were to look at the actual evidence, real proof, the only ones you've got to go on are the ones where people were filmed making them. And that's probably less than 10% of all the crop circles. So you could argue, actually, around 90% of crop circles are unexplained. That doesn't mean they're not man-made. And it doesn't mean they're not alien-made or psychic-made, but they're unexplained. And as I said right at the beginning, in the end, we decided all we can do is just say what we see. There is you cannot put a percentage on it. So I do question what that finding came out with. There's nobody that can be sure what the percentage is. You must just believe what feels right. However, Colin Andrews, Pat Delgado, and also I would put into that Terence Mead and people like Busty Taylor, these early researchers did enormous good. And even though I didn't agree with everything they all believed, they did enormous good in looking at it very forensically. They took a lot of very good data collection, which now is a gold mine. to go back to that early work and compare to what we're having now. And no one's going to take that away from them, and all power to them. Doesn't mean you have to agree with everyone, just because they say something you don't like, but it doesn't mean, therefore, that you should demonize them. There's too much of that goes on today in the UFO world, in the conspiracy world. Oh, he said that, and I don't like that, so therefore he's the enemy. It's just pathetic. It's just ridiculous. You don't agree, end of the story, but you might agree on something else. And that's how I stand with a lot of the researchers of the early days, who I think, they only knew what they knew then. We have now got a lot more perspective. We've gathered a lot more data now, and it's easy to go back and criticize. But back then, they were the pioneers, and, I take my hat off to them.
Yeah, 100%, and fully agree on that whole idea of, because someone's got a difference of opinion to you, that is to be demonized, and your opinion's better than theirs. And very often those opinions can be very one-sided or drawn on a very limited data set, and people project them as if you don't agree with this, you've got malicious intent, and it's ridiculous. And it does go on far too often, just around the world in general. And regarding the numbers, I think similar to UFO videos, sightings, testimony from civilians, military, whatever it might be, if even 99% of all crop circles were man-made or had a prosaic, boring explanation. Same with UFO sightings videos, 99.99%. If they turned around and said, other than that one's genuine, that's anomalous, then that's all that actually matters, because then there's the mystery. And the numbers are far greater than that. Anyone listening to this or viewing that knows it. But for me, that's why it's not necessarily important that there is a lot of noise out there in terms of these conversations, but there's a lot of real, genuine mystery and interest to be found within it as well. So appreciate that. Couple of questions from Josh. Josh asks, does there appear to be any correlation between the design of a crop circle and the type of crop it was left in? And also, have you come across any reports of changes made to food that used crops had previously been part of a crop circle?
That's a good question. I am not aware of any distinct symbolic difference between one in, say, wheat, or one in, say, barley, or one in, say, canola or rapeseed, as we would call it over here. They have been fairly consistent over the years. In terms of eating it, now that's a fair point, because, of course, we've been eating crop circles for years. The farmers will come in, they'll pick up a lot of that grain. And if a crop circle doesn't get walked in too much, that crop will come right back up again and grow back towards the light, which is another interesting point. It's not so smashed down that it isn't still growing and ripening. So a lot of that food's gone into the food chain over the years. Now, people have made beer and bread and all kinds of things using crop circle grain. As far as I'm aware, nothing too awful has ever happened or wonderful has ever happened to anyone. But that doesn't mean it's not worthy of study. And I mentioned earlier on the underground water. That's an interesting point, because a lot of people have said, how do we know that if these things are giving off energy fields and all the things that people try to look at, that isn't then affecting the water course underneath it, which is then, of course, spreading that energy field around the world. If you believe in homeopathy, you definitely believe that. And that's an interesting point. So some have argued that the crop circles are kind of acupuncture points, changing the energy field there, but knowing that the water beneath it will take on that energy field and spread it around the world. That's very new agey, but I quite like that. There's no way of proving it, I don't think. But there's researchers like Lucy Pringle's done lots of, she buries bottles of water in crop circles and then gets people to douse them and sees whether the energy fields change. And great, why not? All that kind of work should be done. And she's had some really interesting results from that. So, yeah, eating them, drinking the water there, who knows, it might have an effect. But certainly I've never heard of anybody eating crop circle grain and anything terrible happening to them. So that at least we can say.
Question from, I've skimmed past the name, Derek. So thanks, Derek. Is Andy up to date with Skinwalker Ranch and beyond Skinwalker Ranch? The description of orbs are very similar to the orbs filmed over cornfields, while circles appear underneath. What is his thoughts on this? And also, in the UK, TV crews equipment failing while in circles in the 80s, and strange sounds on headphones, very similar to events that occur in Utah at Skinwalker Ranch.
Yes. Skinwalker's a fascinating thing. I mean, I've not been there, can't comment personally, but from what I can see, I think there is something genuine going on there. I think mythology gets added to it. And I think that's the problem. It's now so famous and so well known that a lot of things get pulled in that may or may not be related. But I see no reason to disbelieve that there are portals. I don't know what else to call them. It's again a bit new agey, but there are portals where things come and go from different dimensions. I think that that is true of certain houses, certain fields, certain places. In my own work researching ghosts, which is a whole other thing we've not gone into today, I think there's certainly an element of truth to that. There are places where time and space is leaky, and for whatever reason, the holes get torn. And it seems to enable entities to come through from a number of different places. And it's like they come and they gather. And a lot of the stuff at Skinwalker has been very bizarre and not seemingly all coming from the same place. And then plus the balls of light. I haven't, with crop circles, heard as such of very overt, weird entities seen walking around. There are claims, but it's rarer. Okay, so strange dark shapes walking around. It's much rarer, but certainly, I mean, strange sounds, as your questioner there has raised, have been recorded. A high-pitched whistling or trilling sound. Now, some said that might be an unusual bird, a grasshopper warbler, and sometimes it probably is, but also there might be other things that are harder to explain. High-frequency sound is something that has been attached to crop circles, because if you look at cymatic shapes, that's where you vibrate high frequency sound either through oil or sand. You can get these incredible natural patterns to occur. And some have thought, well, is that how some of these circles are appearing? If that's true, that might then make sense of when people do claim they hear this very on the edge of hearing high-pitched sound. I mean, we don't know, but I don't rule that out. That is not impossible. And certainly many people who've been into crop circles, as I say, have felt energy, again, such a loose term, I know, but like a loose electrical field going through them of some kind. Again, you're down to, is that part of the crop circle? Some say certain designs will focus that more. Some have claimed, some have given them a bad feeling, but then other people have come into the same formation and it's given them a lovely feeling. So I have a feeling that these things, it's almost like they accelerate what you take in there with you. I'm not quite sure, some are good and some are bad, but I do think that they do connect with natural energy fields. And even if it wasn't the energy fields that made that shape in the first place, if it's there, and you've got a shape, and look up, the power of shape. Shape can hold energy, it can contain things. And so it's still going to have a power being on that spot anyway, whether it was made by aliens, people, natural forces, the same thing. It may well be that the effects are real nonetheless.
And question from Dave Smethurst. I've picked one of Dave's along with Peter, and if you don't mind staying on for a few more minutes when we finish up, Andy, I've got some bonus content for the folks who pay for the podcast made up of Dave and Peter's extra questions. But Dave asks an interesting question. Does Andy think the intelligence agencies like the CIA, the NRO, etc., with access to satellite imagery have made any progress in decoding what crop circles mean?
So this is another question that's been asked a lot, and it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Because look, they've got satellites up there basically looking down on virtually every inch of land, as far as we can tell. I think we can reasonably surmise that whoever, governments, intelligences, must have footage either showing dots of people moving around all night making the shapes, or no crop circle there, a couple of frames later, there it is. They must have that evidence. Now, we have asked in the past to share it. Well, we've approached the MOD, Ministry of Defence, and the Ministry of Agriculture, as it used to be back a few years ago. And of course, basically, they just tell you to mind your own business, which I find quite interesting, because they haven't released footage showing every crop circle being man-made. Maybe by doing that, you'd realise you were all being spied on, and they don't want to show people that. But I find it fascinating that you think they've got to have that evidence one way or the other, and they've never shared it. Short of hiring our own satellite and surveying a lot of ground for a long time, And of course, that's probably beyond the means of the average researcher. I don't think we're going to know. But yes, I think they must have an awful lot more knowledge in their memory banks than we're ever going to be told about, as is clearly the case for UAP stroke UFOs. Yes, they must do. Maybe a time will come, and maybe that's what we're heading towards, if disclosure comes, where that kind of information will be shared. I mean, maybe that would be part of it. But yeah, I definitely believe that must exist. But so far, we haven't got anywhere. And just in brief, we wrote years ago to the Ministry of Agriculture saying, what is your position on crop circles? And they came back and just said, we are aware of the situation and are monitoring it, which I thought was quite an interesting response. They didn't say it's a load of old rubbish, go away. So, yeah, they must know more.
If you are on the free feeds listening to this, then we'll be leaving you here. Thank you very much, folks. If you're on any of the paid feeds or you want to support the podcast, you'll get some extra bonus content with some additional questions, and Andy joining me for those in the next couple of minutes. But if you're leaving us here, Andy, can you let the audience know how they can get in touch with you and also pick up a copy of your work?
Yeah, so if you have a look at my website, which is truthagenda.org, you'll find out all about me, lots of videos to watch. You can contact me through the website. You'll see all about the books. Just look me up on Amazon, Andy Thomas. So the current book is The New Heretics, Conspiracies before that, also The Truth Agenda, and my Crop Circle books. And have a look at it. You'll find them all out there somewhere. But thanks for your support.
And all those links will be in the description as well, folks. If you're leaving us here, thank you very, very much for joining us. Andy, been a pleasure. And if you're hanging around for a bit more content, then here we go. We'll get straight into it. That is all for this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. Apple and Spotify do make a huge difference to the algorithm. If you're checking the show out on YouTube, please don't forget to like and leave a comment on here as well. Any sharing you do is very much appreciated on any social media platform. And finally, you can listen to shows ad-free and sponsor-free in their glorious full versions by subscribing for less than the price of a coffee on Apple, Spotify. Just search That UFO Podcast Premium. YouTube, you can sign up and be a member, or you can do that through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, folks.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked it for him.